Approximately 10 feet over his neck, the menacing rim of a sharpened blade casts a gloom upon a mass of black hair. A gentleman is restrained beneath the execution machine, under the darkest, most terrifying shadow that could ever darken one's spirit. He gazes, bright emerald eyes, desolate and blank, when confronted by the inescapable force of the darkness that hovers above. The green-eyed prisoner cannot help but ponder how circumstances reached this point. An observer, a woman in the multitude, inquired what the nobleman had done to warrant such degradation, and another man reprimanded her, suggesting she guard her speech or she might be the next victim. She ought to have witnessed enough to comprehend what brutal oppressors governed them. The sole action the common populace could take in this scenario was to remain silent and avoid conflict. Now that conflict had engulfed the entire continent, ordinary individuals like them were compelled to be as still as field mice. Ravens and corvids circled above the execution stand as many assembled to observe the forthcoming slaughter. It was an era of conflict and adversity. Once the flames of bloodshed grasped the entire eastern landmass, the lethal inferno simply refused to diminish, causing the revered whole House of Marbas to become the newest casualty of this awful confrontation. The final inheritor knelt before the people, trapped within the killing apparatus as he awaited his demise. Thus, destiny extracts its heavy cost. The strong pursue their desires, while the weak quietly endure to survive. Unlike the robust, the weak were obliged to jeopardize their existence every single day, praying they wouldn't finish as sustenance for the birds. In contrast to the powerful, the disadvantaged had to engage in a struggle with fatality itself, eventually, by one route or another. The entrances of the inferno were the only location where the vulnerable could anticipate the welcome relief of their termination. This was the hellish scenario to which the land had been diminished. The leader of Clan Sylvester, a rival dynasty to House Marbas, Count Alan de Sylvester, sat with an arrogant, loathsome smirk on his face as he contemplated his triumph. The fellow requested that the spectacle commence, and murmurings echoed throughout the assembly. The executioner, a youthful male who possessed a strange and noticeable likeness to the individual scheduled to perish, was immobilized in place, earning the contempt of the Sylvester lord. The wicked noble once more commanded the killing to commence. At this moment, the counterpart struggled onward, swaying as he proceeded, his grip tightening on the dagger he carried. The restrained figure of his victim was directly ahead, and the boy stopped beside the guillotine's cord, apprehension surging through him. The Lord of Sylvester could scarcely conceal his pleasure and requested the youth to promptly sever the rope. Again, the executioner advanced laboriously and stood over the cord that determined another's existence. Slowly, the lookalike's arms ascended, the certainty of the circumstance weighing heavily on his emotions and on the spirits of those observing. The Lord of Sylvester leaned forward in expectation as the cord was sliced in a decisive cut. The grim reality was that the fatal sound of the sharp blade separating a neck was indistinguishable from the heavy blow of a cleaver against a butcher's block. The executioner gazed in blank-eyed terror as drops of deep red fluid created a gruesome pale surface on his complexion. The fluid barely registered, and neither did the moisture flowing down his cheeks. It only lent undeniable verification to the dark picture amidst the metallic scent. In fate's merciless style, this was the impossible responsibility the young person was tasked to endure. To rid the world of Leon von Marbas. No, to sever all connections between the earthly realm and his own progenitor. The liquid collecting on the ground belonged to the one who had formerly fathered him and embraced him securely. Truly, the young boy with the empty gaze closely resembled the deceased because they shared a biological link. The child was Leon von Marbas, the progeny of the departed Leon von Marbas, and a relative killer who functioned as his father's executioner. The head of the family, this was the title frequently given to the chieftain of the noble lineage. As the designation implies, the patriarch is not only a member of the elite class, but also constitutes a central support of the nation. However, as one playwright famously stated, uneasy sits the head that wears the royal circlet. The obligation of authority must only be granted to those capable of bearing it. Now Leon was sitting at a dinner table amidst an aggregation of aristocrats. He was currently the new head of House Marbas, and he watched as the nobles argued amongst themselves vehemently. Some were distressed at the rapid expansion of House Sylvester, daily, and there was no way of knowing when they might openly seize Marbas's domain. A government official stated that it would be crucial for them to reinforce their security, and they insisted that their patriarch decide immediately. They wanted to hear their wise counsel. Nonetheless, Leon simply dismissed the official. He instructed his council to remain patient just a short while longer, expressing his need for additional time to deliberate. The others were naturally disappointed to hear this, proclaiming it a pressing concern. The present circumstances predicted misfortune for the formerly prominent House Marbas. After the death of his sire, Lord Leon von Marbas, Leon von Marbas had ascended to the role of patriarch of House Marbas at the tender age of 14. House Marbas was once feared as a mighty organization of dark sorcerers, although that prestige had long since faded into the historical records. The boy paused before the suspended images of his deceased parents. His mother and his father were no longer living, and he considered what actions they would take in his position. The child understood that his request would go unanswered, for the dead hold no conversation, and his progenitors could not offer wisdom from the afterlife.
The continent, during his era. It is recounted that their house first achieved notoriety as the original Marbas patriarch made his standing on the battlefield. However, ever since the peak of their founding progenitor, their descendants had consistently failed to produce another accomplished necromancer. This subsequently led their family wealth down a track of deterioration. The young fellow sighed. Ultimately, he had been coerced into ending his own father's existence, and he opened the door to his private workspace. Proceeding inside, the boy ambled toward the desk and brushed dust off a copy of the records of their family ancestry. The inaugural Marbas patriarch, Leon von Marbas, was an almost mythical character. With a gesture of his hand, he would eliminate his adversaries like a deadly squall, calling forth hordes of a deceased in an infinite lethal march. By the time the eastern territories had been brought under his dominion, barely 2 months had transpired completely. It was claimed that Wellen had forged an alliance with the fiend Marbas and uncovered one of the great puzzles of the continent, specifically the secrets of controlling the dead using the ominous grimoire, the Necronomicon. This then provided their founder with the strength required to govern as the ruler of the landmass. Now, the adolescent chief was observing the Necronomicon itself, a massive black volume featuring an eye centered on its cover. It was an invaluable relic that had been inherited from their forefather himself and the very manuscript that led to the elevation of House Marbas as the exclusive lineage of dark sorcerers on the continent. Naturally, all those glorious periods are gone now. Leon casually turned the pages of the massive book, but froze when a voice spoke out. The sound requested the young patriarch to heed carefully. Leon was startled and questioned the source of that voice. He speculated if a mental message had reached the leader's chamber despite the magical barrier. Choosing to address the situation directly, the young fellow inquired who he was conversing with. The voice responded that Leon had no cause for alarm and that it presented no danger to the youth or his relatives. The young lord questioned why he should accept such an audacious declaration, and a crimson magical ring materialized around him, overwhelming him with a brilliant eruption of energy. Leon managed to force his eyes open and glance up in astonishment and surprise to behold a massive demonic creature standing before him. Stunned, the young lord inquired about his location, and the demon pondered, asking if the family's predecessor had neglected to inform them of its presence. The boy was amazed, asking if the entity knew his sire. The entity did indeed know his sire, and it knew him by name. The being sensed that the connection linking them had been broken, so now it had appeared to Leon. The creature growled, asserting that it had long worried that Rune's temperament was much too gentle for the leader of a sinister dynasty. It should have anticipated that Rune would face an premature end. In any case, it wasn't going to mourn the loss, and it moved closer to Leon, inquiring who had delivered his father's fatal blow. A highly uncomfortable discussion had arisen, but the despondent-eyed boy simply responded that the individual who took his father's life had been none other than the one currently facing the creature. Leon von Marbas had been the one to end his own father's life. This provoked a tremendous burst of fury from the Marbas entity. The being was surprisingly outraged, and it stated that it would pose the question to the boy one final time. With a perilous snarl and an aura that boiled with fierce power, the creature asked if Leon was the one who murdered his oath-bound ally. Once more, the young, empty-eyed child affirmed that he had been the one to slay his sire. The demon's eyes glowed with fierce scarlet anger, and it sprang at the boy with a ferocious sound. The youth gazed at the advancing entity, only a slight look of astonishment on his features as he stared into the jaws of destruction. He could still remember the bloodstains on his hands. It was as if the demon was examining his recollections. Marbas witnessed the collapsed form of his previous lord, and the emotionless tears the young boy had shed. Perceiving the truth, the demon announced that Leon had been bereft of his sanity. The hands that cut the cord were his, but the child had not genuinely executed his father. However, Leon insisted that this conclusion was inaccurate. The demon observed the miserable boy, a hint of amusement on the massive lion's face. The youth is desperate. What truly escaped the demon's comprehension was the profound dark energy it could feel within the child. The all-consuming gloom lingered beneath the surface of the young lord's skin, and the demon couldn't help but be curious how such an adolescent had become this melancholic. A child shouldn't possess such a potent reservoir of mystical energy. There was a disturbance in the area as the boy stepped ahead, and examining closer, the demon could identify energy surging beneath the boy's feet, red and menacing, with many forms writhing along with it. The demon was shocked and believed that the scene it was currently witnessing was utterly preposterous. The boy before him had the capacity to potentially even exceed his forefather. Marbas cleared its throat briefly and chose to introduce itself. It was Marbas, one of the 72 infernal entities who abandoned the demonic realm and opted to coexist with humanity instead. A lifelong companion of Leon von Marbas and the genesis of the dark magic that became the distinct craft of House Marbas. The boy recognized the demon from the legends. When the founder established House Marbas, the demon was the one who instructed him in the forbidden art of commanding the dead. Indeed, the massive creature was the very manuscript that led to the elevation of House Marbas as the exclusive lineage of dark sorcerers on the continent.
Same one the boy spoke of. Nevertheless, it was now bound to the Necronomicon because it was a formidable fiend long ago. Marbas the Black Lion, the founding patriarch, frequently asserted that the dark arts ran in the blood of the members of their noble house. However, Leon could not grasp why the great lion deserted them in the end. The boy's eyes flared with suppressed indignation, and the demon was puzzled by his accusation. The lion inquired why the boy would harbor such a belief, so Leon elaborated. Ever since the time of their ancestor, Lord Wellen, House Marbas has been unable to produce a necromancer of his ability. This was surely an indication then that the lion of their lineage had abandoned them. The lion listened to the boy's explanation, paying close attention, and then it decided to clarify a point. The reason why the noble family had been incapable of wielding the authentic might of a necromancer was that they were too feeble to provide a suitable conduit. The boy was perplexed and asked further about this conduit concept. Not a single member of the Marbas clan could compare to the sheer expertise that Wellen possessed. This was merely a prediction of their hereditary decline. Leon remained silent as he contemplated this answer to his inquiry. Then he decided to accept the lion's assertion, and the demon acknowledged that the boy was quick to embrace reality. Of course, for the vulnerable to suffer defeat during wartime was simply an unchangeable rule of the cosmos.
The lion wondered aloud if this was how the boy had reconciled with his father's death. The boy stated that it would make no difference. Honestly, there was nothing exceptional about his father's departure. And that being said, unless the demon had entirely forsaken their house, the boy had a request to present to Lord Marbas. The enormous lion was curious about this request, and it declared that it would grant no such thing. A request was an act of goodwill in which one potentially stands to incur a cost. The boy should refer to any transaction with a fiend as a covenant or a bargain. So the young patriarch agreed to a pact for the ability of dark sorcery. The two exchanged glances, and Leon inquired if it was within the lion's capability to grant that ability to him. The formidable demon sneered with its head lifted, stating that a mere boy had no right to question its power. Moreover, it wondered what precisely it had observed in the boy to make it bestow him with its power. Did the youth genuinely believe he possessed the potential worthy to wield its potent necromancy? Without delay, the boy responded that he did possess the potential, and, had he been some unskilled peasant, he would never have been permitted to trade communications with such an elevated fiend. Ultimately, it was claimed that common individuals needed only to merely chat with the demon before they were stripped of all magical energy, experienced spectral visions, and finally forfeited their lives once the creature finished with them. Considering that the youngster currently remained upright, it could only signify that he was worth at least a test. He possessed some measure of capability. The monster could not criticize the young fellow's reasoning, as he himself could perceive that the child had aptitude and courage. Indeed, Marbas declared that any solicitation of a demon would constitute a covenant, and that was vital to recall. The boy asserted that it was not irrational to believe that he might possess something valuable to provide in exchange. The demon fixed its gaze upon the youth for a moment before simply bursting into maniacal mirth. There was absolutely no chance this juvenile could offer anything of consequence to the enormous beast. Nevertheless, he was intrigued by the proposition. Captivated, the lion stated that he would establish an agreement with the young sovereign of the dark sorcery lineage. Subsequently, Leon inquired what compensation the demon would demand from him, and the massive creature grinned malevolently. With a vicious smirk, Marbas announced that his fee would encompass every component of Leon's essence. The hollow-eyed lord stared intensely and at length at his family antiquity and smiled just as wickedly as he declared that this was a relief to hear, for he would willingly relinquish every element of his insignificant existence. It was a great solace to know, as Leon would gleefully sacrifice every fragment of this paltry life, and the lion recoiled momentarily upon witnessing such an evil smirk on such a young boy. In the interim, back within the deliberation chamber, the aristocrats were assembled and they sat in quietude. Eventually, the elderly man began to speak, stating that as the majority of the gentlemen were cognizant, their current patriarch, Leon von Marbas, commands minimal authority to make judgments of grave significance that impact the entire household. Though impeccably dressed, the old man had clearly exhibited some uncouth demeanor upon entering the entrance, and he questioned if the other members of the Marbas council concurred. Since they offered no disagreement, he accepted that as approval and proceeded. Therefore, in the old man's capacity as the uncle and nearest relative of the existing patriarch, he intended to take control of all matters concerning their lineage for the foreseeable future. The boy had departed for merely a few moments, and his advisory board was already plotting to betray him. Now the uncle asserted that he would permit the remaining council to voice their sentiments regarding his installation as the estate manager. One of the other nobles declared that they would be foolish to dissent, considering that the alternative is a mere fledgling who had not yet reached the required age to inherit the domain, or anything specific. Consequently, the individual with the slicked-back hairstyle voted for the uncle to assume command, proclaiming that they could not entrust these essential determinations to an undeserving youth. He believed there was no better candidate to manage the affairs of the house than the uncle, Sir Kirchel.
That as it may, the gentleman with the moustache objected to the proposal. Lord Leon was the sole direct blood descendant of the former patriarch. There was no established custom in their familial history for appointing the succeeding patriarch in violation of direct ancestry. Nevertheless, the dissenting man contended that tradition would not assist them if their entire bloodline were annihilated. He presented a highly compelling argument. The forces of those Sylvester ruffians were advancing against them at that very instant. Slicked Hair could not fault Moustache for hesitating and expressing reservations concerning legitimate birthright and related matters, but they needed to realize that voting against the uncle meant choosing to perish alongside the oblivious young noble. Slicked Hair, conversely, would prioritize his own survival initially. Moustache emphatically struck his palm against the table, accusing the other noblemen of speaking inappropriately. Every single one of them was granted a seat at this council by the benevolence of the departed lord. They owed it to this dynasty to contend until the very end, not quarrel like a pack of scavengers. Even if the current patriarch had yet to assemble his own supporters, Moustache would not stand idly by and observe his uncle seize his rightful position as successor. The uncle was a malicious, domineering presence, nearly as treacherous and unpardonable as the individual who had executed the previous lord. And Moustache hoped for direction from Rune's spirit. It was genuinely unfortunate that their esteemed lord had abandoned them to the clutches of this unscrupulous predator. The uncle chuckled softly, stating that it was certainly a brave yet entertaining viewpoint. Leon von Marbas, their current patriarch, possessed at least one faithful servant, it appeared. Moustache instructed the uncle to speak plainly, as he had no patience for games. As devoted as Moustache might be, he lacked any sort of cunning required in political maneuverings. The uncle, conversely, possessed excessive cunning, and he could plainly see that the situation was already decided. No other aristocrat at the table had opposed the arrangement, and Moustache stood with concern etched on his face. Portland, That was his name, and he was a kind older gentleman. Therefore, the uncle advised the man to heed his wise counsel and to relinquish the issue. After all, the uncle had summoned them all today, and it was certainly not because he had any consideration for Pollen's views whatsoever. The mustachioed man would not be intimidated, and he cursed, recognizing that this circumstance was orchestrated by the wicked uncle. Kirchel told the stout man to weigh his upcoming remarks cautiously for the benefit of his household, if nothing else. The mustachioed man tensed as he was reminded that they had all gathered for one objective, solely to execute an unpleasant decision that would nonetheless represent the least detrimental option for the lineage. The stout man had no reason to obstruct their preservation, and all they requested was for him to allow their collective judgment to take precedence. The mustachioed man was beginning to understand that he was merely a pawn in the uncle's scheme from the very beginning. The man implored the deceased lord's spirit to pardon and show compassion for a miserable retainer who failed to safeguard his heritage. While all this transpired, Leon was occupied acquiring some impressive new infernal capabilities. He stood before the colossal fiend Marbas, and the lion mused, noting that all was satisfactory, except for one detail. Due to the alteration in the subject of the agreement, the actual scope of the lion's strength had been restricted. As gentle and guileless as his father Rune was, as Marbas's contractor, the man had commanded a much larger magical reserve than his son currently held. Upon reflection, the boy did seem to recall that any demon who entered a covenant with a mortal had to draw mystical energy from their contractor to replenish their own supply. The boy then wanted to know his responsibilities in that regard, and he wished to accelerate the procedure. The colossal lion mentioned that there was remarkably little the boy could achieve in his present state. However, they should make do with his current magical power for the time being. With a quick snap of his digits, the enormous volume opened, and the great lion adopted a more manageable shape to accommodate the quantity of energy the boy currently possessed. He now appeared very much like the world's fluffiest black feline. This iteration should be less taxing to sustain. Leon was not disheartened, and he reasoned that this made sense. The entity was certainly charming enough to be considered a domestic animal. The boy scarcely completed his compliment before Marbas's demon shadow flared with his actual form as he warned the youth to never again presume to call him adorable. He might be small momentarily, but he swore to cover his contractor's face in a maze of teeth and claw lacerations. Leon was not seriously intimidated by that menace, but for the purpose of securing what he wanted, he agreed to the term. The fuzzy feline rumbled, stating that now that we are in accord, it is time for us to depart. The boy was surprised and inquired about their destination. Clearly, the young lord aspired to gain power that would rival even his ancestor, and he certainly recalled asking for that. If he were to have any prospect of ascending to the same prominence that he did, then what superior method to emulate his path than to quite literally follow his exact route? It sounded acceptable enough to the young lord, so it was time for them to journey to the concealed sanctuary of his forefather. He was completely oblivious to his noble position being seized directly from beneath him. The dangers of the expedition they were about to undertake could claim his existence, and Marbas asked if Leon still intended to proceed. Of course he did. The boy couldn't care less about remaining alive, and he did not understand why his determination kept being questioned. The kitten was rather proud of him, and began to lead the way, instructing the young contractor to keep pace if he was able. So the young fellow followed, and the pair advanced into the nearby woods. The lad recognized the foggy groves belonging to House Marbas. The forest could be an impenetrable maze for those who were not of his lineage. Then the boy remembered that his father had informed him that only the rightful patriarch may place foot inside the confidential sanctuary itself. However, he found it peculiar that the location was supposed to grant
predecessors the ability of dark sorcery, but it had failed to accomplish that very thing. The kitten clarified that none of the predecessors had successfully completed the ordeal, and they had likely been judged deficient when it came to the most fundamental prerequisite of all. Only those who possessed the purest hue of black, the essence of the void, could clear a path to the sanctuary. No one to date had been capable of satisfying this initial condition to pass through the thick, swirling and magical purple vapor. The boy could see that it appeared quite obvious. Marbas raised a paw and the mist dissipated to reveal an entrance. Without further preamble, the kitten smiled, anxious to commence the primary challenge. Heir stood inside the location, and Leon was granted permission to enter as a descendant. The boy stepped forward, observing the masonry coated in moss. The boy was cautioned, naturally, that he would no longer have the demon's support. The boy accepted this, as the kitten had mentioned that it would be a test after all. The cat grinned and said that he did possess one piece of counsel to provide. The boy was to comply with the Necronomicon's guidelines at all times. It would guide the youth along the trajectory toward his reward. The capability of dark sorcery. It was dim at the base of the staircase, but there was sufficient illumination from lanterns and the glowing grimoire. Leon paused when he abruptly heard a shriek in the gloom, and he pivoted to look down the dark passage. One of the lamps ignited with a green light, and a group of green, bulky, and muscular beings materialized in the darkness. The boy stared down and saw beside him a maiden bound before the creatures that appeared to be goblins. With barely any response to the situation surrounding him, the boy seized his purple volume and opened a few sheets. He located the instruction manual on how to maximize the efficacy of the divine artifact, the Necronomicon. The first hidden technique was resurrecting the deceased. The boy stared at the book in silence for a moment, and he looked at the empty hallways and the goblins that were now rushing toward him. There did not seem to be any corpses to revive, so the boy looked back at the book, which stated he must initiate by ending a life. Well, he had already performed that action once before. Thus, he closed the volume and picked up his short sword, his eyes gleaming with the fierce resolution of an assassin. He noticed the restrained, voluptuous stranger and her torn garments.
evidently goblin entertainment, and the goblins snarled to see him ogling their captive. The young patriarch stepped forward, blade in hand, and then there was a sudden detonation as one of the goblins leaped into the air, yelling homicide. The boy was unaffected as the goblin approached, evading the creature's initial strike. Then he swung his weapon, cleaving the charging beast before him. It seems the boy had dedicated some time after patricide to honing his killing skills somewhat. Blood streamed from the felled goblin, and the boy spun, his eyes alight with death, to see who was next. The melancholy boy once found himself within a graveyard encompassed by the solemn atmosphere that frequently accompanied such a serious location. Then his father had told him to listen carefully. In the great house of Marbas, he queried the youth which entity they cherished with the utmost respect. The reply was straightforward. Naturally, the aristocratic lineage was the sort that venerated mortality itself. This was because they were a dynasty of dark sorcerers with authority over the perished. Consequently, the prominent family was required to hold fatality itself in the highest estimation. The adolescent boy contemplated his father's statements and then inquired about the meaning of that notion. How was it plausible for them to venerate death? He believed that necromancers were the kind of people who harvested lives, whether they desired to or not. In the end, they needed to accumulate more might as shadow practitioners. The boy's father smiled, his emerald gaze radiating warmth as he observed that his beloved son had been researching their ancestral background. Indeed, it was accurate that they were a family of shadow wizards who provoked fear in innumerable individuals across the landmass. Yet that fact did not necessitate that they ought to transform into ruthless antagonists themselves. That is why the benevolent father made his offspring pledge one commitment. Regardless of whom Leon encountered in warfare eventually, provided that he held authority over life or death over them, then Leon had to promise that he would make their demise as tranquil as possible. The young man with the blank stare regarded his father, and he pondered now if his progenitor would still desire him to honor his commitment for every adversary he faced. Now the boy confronted goblins in a gloomy subterranean corridor, their blatant depravity evident in the woman they held captive. Without reservation, the young noble had struck down one of their number, and he stared blankly as he was encircled by the upcoming
contenders. His enemies displayed no grief for their fallen associate. Vile smirks spread across their repulsive and corrupted lips, each certain they could best the young male. The deceased goblin spilled crimson fluid at the young lad's feet, and he had to aim for the neck bones with deadly accuracy. He would slay them with a single blow, upholding the vow he made to his father. There was no superior method to eliminate a foe with minimal suffering. The miniature Marbas watched the young aristocrat, observing that it didn't appear as though Leon had possessed much competence with a blade. Yet the boy had struck the vertebrae with perfect precision. It was remarkable to witness the young fellow engage in combat. The lion demon questioned if the initial strike had been purely an accident, a sudden stroke of fortune, or perhaps an innate aptitude of some kind. Grinning with pleasure, the fiend knew that he would shortly discover the truth as numerous goblins advanced toward his young protege. Leon acknowledged that he had successfully vanquished one of them, but that was more fortune than expertise. Goblins were a cunning species and deceptive by nature. Their eyes shone scarlet with the expectation of shredding him to pieces, and he had to maintain his vigilance. The boy gripped his weapon's hilt tightly, preparing himself for their subsequent assault. The gloom did make judging height somewhat challenging. Furthermore, the young boy's sight could dim with every passing moment as the evening advanced. He recollected that a light source extinguished when he dispatched the first goblin, so he needed to adapt to the darkness quickly while he could and vanquished a large quantity of opponents. Therefore, instead of hacking through the adversary, the boy should look to penetrate and dislodge with as much accuracy as feasible. Moving rapidly, the boy left another opponent behind and charged into their midst. His gaze promised fatality as he descended to eradicate his adversary. The implement connected truthfully, and yet another green enemy collapsed with a tortured shriek of agony. Just as Leon had anticipated, another light source flickered out as the creature hit the ground. Another goblin roared with a scream, lunging at Leon with surprising swiftness. However, the Marbas nobleman was prepared for him, and he pivoted around just in time, ducking out of the trajectory when the goblin brought its weapon downward. Two had assailed him from different directions, and they collided with one another in the center in fierce fighting. Exploiting their distraction, Leon eliminated yet another goblin, severing its windpipe swiftly, and another illumination ceased. The boy's sight was becoming accustomed to the gloom, so he should be able to perceive adequately, even if more light sources failed. It was quite unfortunate, though, that his short sword was beginning to sustain damage from his encounters with the savage beasts. He could not expect the edge to endure for long. After all, it was merely an ornamental dagger. Abruptly, a sharp cry dragged the boy from his contemplation. Yet another goblin rushed him, weapon raised with murderous intent gleaming in its vision. The boy instantly raised his defense, cutting at the entity in a fluid swipe that made contact with the vicious creature's face. Regrettably, the incision he inflicted was much too superficial this time, barely more than an absurdly small nick. The Marbas demon was astonished to see Leon discard his blade, and the boy raised his head as he successfully evaded his enemy's assault. The boy's eyes glittered a calculating green, and Marbas stared impressed and excited. The young nobleman lunged, escaping the goblin's hit and seizing the abandoned implement. Leon snatched the fallen weapon of one of his adversaries and faced the goblin once more, this time with greater ferocious determination. The boy stamped his foot and sprang ahead, slashing at his enemy again with renewed intensity. This time, the boy's incision yielded better outcomes, resulting in a torrent of blood pouring down from the goblin's midsection. A quick slice left the monster in tatters, and the boy retreated as yet another goblin fell to the floor. Without losing a moment, Leon spun. The Marbas boy had annihilated all of his foes, and he stepped forward with dignity and self-assurance, walking deliberately toward the restrained maiden in the subterranean chambers.
The young woman was bound with a rope over her mouth, and she whimpered in fear. After all, she had just observed her young savior make rapid work of monsters twice her magnitude. The boy removed the cord from her mouth, and the distressed girl wept with grateful fluid in her eyes. She thanked him for preserving her existence, her countenance the image of perfect appreciation. She spoke further on how deeply she was indebted to the boy, but the unfortunate girl did not get far in her declaration before she was abruptly stabbed. The boy's bloody sword had perforated directly through the shocked, voluptuous maiden. Her own hero had terminated her existence. The girl was speechless, staring into the vacant and dark eyes of her liberator, and he simply withdrew the blade, dispatching her as swiftly as he had ended the goblins. Leon stared at the girl, stating that he was reminded of another piece of astute advice from his progenitor. He had been informed of fiends with the capacity to imitate human beings, which his father had encountered during his expeditions across the continent. This is why it was so uncomplicated for him now.
Execute the lady before him, and she collapsed with a guttural, monstrous shriek. The creature now revealed its true form, growling with claws extended as she regarded her enemy. The boy's father had also cautioned him to never forget that those who misled and exploited the trust of others did not merit peaceful deaths. Those types of individuals had to experience the exact same dread and hopelessness that they inflicted upon their victims. And toward that goal, Leon's eyes shone with deep green and malicious intensity as he concluded that the demon girl could benefit from a small instruction in agony. He felt she ought to concur. Her screams reverberated throughout the dungeon as he attended to her, and finally, the last light source failed. There was dancing, ladies in stunning red gowns, captivating the spectators with their graceful movements. The dining hall was crowded with beverages and goblets, with Leon's uncle positioned at the center of it all, roaring with laughter and glee because his wicked schemes were ultimately materializing. It would not be long before the estate was firmly within his control, and he celebrated by having his arm draped in very suggestive ways around two young women. The women encouraged inebriation and revelry, since they desired his money regardless. A distinguished gentleman such as himself ought to be the leader of the household over a youthful-looking boy. That made considerably more sense after all. The other lady agreed, saying that Sir Kirchel was nothing short of remarkable. She never could have conceived that he would utilize the Sylvesters to achieve his objective. That despicable, backstabbing fool had brokered a bargain with the enemy clan to ascend to the top position. The women flattered and boosted the man's vanity, saying that it required a genuine man to be a treacherous scoundrel. The man laughed, accepting the praise, stating that he had been forced to grovel and submit to the Sylvester filth. However, he never had to worry about that anymore, and he happily drained a tankard full of fermented beverage. Groveling and submitting was by far the lesser of two misfortunes when contrasted with his nephew, whom he referred to as a pathetic weakling. The man was confident that his nephew would lead House Marbas down a trajectory to annihilation. Indeed, it would be infinitely more desirable if he assumed authority instead. After all, who was there who could dispute that the man had played this competition flawlessly? And he had triumphed. The vile creature laughed darkly, and everyone surrounding him laughed as well, especially that slick-haired idiot that agreed with him initially. Speaking of Slick Hair, he wished to know what had become of Leon. The boy had wandered away, and Slick Hair wanted to know the strategy for eliminating the young patriarch. The personnel of the manor were profoundly devoted to the boy's sire, so it would be somewhat challenging to dispose of the young nuisance. However, the uncle was largely unconcerned, and he felt that matters did not need to become complicated whatsoever. Smirking maliciously, the old man disclosed his scheme, saying that the boy's end would be justified following the event. After all, lifeless individuals convey no stories, and neither do their offspring. Slick Hair thought this was well articulated, and he assumed that the last time anyone heard from the deceased was centuries prior, when the founding Marbas patriarch had wielded the might of dark sorcery. More drink was poured, golden and beautiful, as the men continued to laugh and rejoice in their depravity. They offered a salute to their subsequent and rightful patriarch of the Marbas lineage, Sir Kirchel. There was hilarity and profound levels of intoxicated merriment. The enjoyment persisted, with the women dancing provocatively in the background as the wicked men chuckled with their companions beside them. Meanwhile, back in a very important residence, the patriarch of House Sylvester wished to be certain that his initiative to conquer House Marbas was advancing according to his design. His associates, naturally, gave him the reassurance he desired to hear. The Grey Eminence Kirchel von Marbas was essentially nothing more than a puppet in their service. They only needed to await the formal authorization for complete warfare from the imperial dynasty. The wicked man smirked, laughing at the incorrigible simpletons who were playing into his tactics. They were rather obtuse to assume that the Sylvester patriarch would postpone the second phase of conflict as if it had not been long since the first. It created a rather useful opportunity for the wicked fair-haired man. Of course, none of this would have been achievable without the Lord's exceptional tactical foresight. The Lord of Sylvester noted the documentation they possessed on Kirchel. To consider that the centuries-long history of House Marbas would conclude at the hands of some short-sighted dullard of a betrayer, it was truly pathetic. Still, the Sylvester nobleman smiled as he envisioned the night of triumphs. He instructed his personnel to accelerate their preparation immediately. Nothing would impede his flawless triumph. First, he executed the father, and now the man eagerly anticipated reveling in the termination of the son. The wicked man could scarcely wait to hear the delightful sound of their cries of distress. Meanwhile, the son in question had just successfully eliminated the last of the fiends that he discovered in the underground. His blade spilled fluid onto the floor,
Extracted it from the body of his most recent casualty, and those green eyes adjusted to the absolute darkness that now encompassed him, with the torches extinguished. The girl seemed to be the last of the monsters in there. Suddenly, there was a brilliant burst of light, and the entire subterranean area instantaneously became illuminated. The boy stared at the flame that now crackled and snapped in its holder, and he ran his fingers through his hair in partial fatigue and partial astonishment. Marbas believed that the young lad was remarkable. The kitten pounced with delight, as he was yet to encounter such a disturbed contractor throughout his existence. The demon found absolute pleasure in how deranged Leon was proving to be. The boy was stunned and found himself knocked directly into a pool of fluid, losing his weapon and everything, as he did not wish to harm Marbas. The cheerful demon felt like his new protege surely possessed sufficient tenacity to survive in an encampment full of orcs, since he was so skilled at maintaining his composure. Tiny Paws happily kneaded Leon's face, and the boy just stared blankly as usual, likely wishing that he was not splashing around in blood. Marbas continued to laugh and commend him, somehow figuring out the disguised entity as a mortal, and how the boy had not hesitated to pierce it through with a blade. Leon finally rose, asserting that he would prefer to avoid any encounters with orcs if at all possible. Then he delicately placed his new kitten onto the ground. The boy knew all about how orcs despised humans above all else as a species. That was no concern to the demon, as he wanted to know why Leon had known to suspect that the girl was conspiring with the others. The boy grew quiet as he considered the reply to that inquiry. It was actually quite straightforward for him. When all the other light sources had gone out, there was still one that remained lit, which must signify that another monster persisted. Yet the only one remaining was the girl. The demon was profoundly intrigued by this reasoning, and Leon clarified that when they first entered that place, he had realized that the illuminations in the vicinity burned a different hue than what they had observed thus far. The light sources burned green to represent the goblins that they had to eliminate. Green was the color of the dead. And sure enough, with every monster that he dispatched, the light sources flickered out sequentially. However, the boy then observed that there was one final light source flaring brightly in the color of green. So clearly, there was one monster left, and the boy could not proceed until it was terminated, although its termination had been a bit more brutal than the others. The kitten stared at the boy who sat in a pool of blood, exhilarated by how dreadfully merciless his new contractor was. The demon had not anticipated a mere adolescent of 14 to deduce so much under such terrible conditions. Now the boy was simply looking around, taking note of his fluid-drenched garment. When one's survival was jeopardized, it could be sufficiently challenging to comprehend the circumstances, much less leap into action without a moment's pause. Yet Leon did precisely that, instantly eliminating all the foes independently in the end. Perhaps there was more to the young prodigy than just the massive magical capacity he contained. It might be that the young nobleman was concealing something genuinely extraordinary as well, something that even the boy did not realize existed. This notion truly captivated Marbas, and the demon smirked with pleasure. It was quite diverting. He eagerly awaited what the youth would exhibit next. Then Marbas elevated the grimoire. With Welland's initial test concluded, it was time for them to advance to the subsequent phase in mastering dark sorcery. The volume's pages fluttered open and then stopped on the next instruction. After terminating the existence of a living entity, it was then time to revive the fallen. The boy stared at the book for a moment and hummed as he understood that he needed to conjure the walking dead. There was a decent assortment of remains available for him to utilize. Freshly departed? So the boy smiled rather wickedly, keen to commence. It was time for Leon to raise the perished. The guidelines were distinct and relatively simple to apply. Hypothetically, he was merely supposed to look intently at the goblins he had slain and then channel his mystical energy to his eyes to enhance his sight. The boy did exactly that. Magical energy gathered in his dark green gaze as he fixed upon the corpses he created. He would perceive on each body a filament that connected it to some unknown location, possibly the netherworld or something similar. Sure enough, the young noble turned toward the remains, and he observed each strand linked to them just as Marbas had detailed. In the terminology of dark sorcerers, this thread was apparently referred to as the death line. This was the boundary that traversed the limits of mortality and attached each spirit with the filament from this plane to the next. Thus, it was seemingly the cord of rebirth. The kitten smiled at the speed with which his student was assimilating knowledge, and he easily plucked at the strings of demise. A dark sorcerer detached the lingering souls of the deceased from their physical forms to resuscitate their spirits, and then breathed new vitality into the bodies by fusing the souls with the dark sorcerer's own mystical energy. The goblins slowly pushed themselves upright as Leon commanded their resurrection.
As the walking dead, the goblins smirked viciously as dark insignia were etched beneath their foreheads. It seemed they mirrored their creator's grin. Each malevolent goblin came alive, now shimmering with a violet energy surrounding them. Marbas then happily demonstrated to his observing pupil. The goblin lunged at Leon, who stood holding the book, and it extended its weapon toward the boy, but naturally, it did not cause him injury. This sequence was designated as branding. There were, of course, other techniques for generating subservient dead, but the demon stated that the sole mechanism that functioned on monsters was branding, and he would reserve the alternate methods for another occasion, as they were still reviewing the fundamentals. The boy noted that and stood up. Now, the demon granted his young protege permission to attempt controlling the dead on his own. However, before engaging in any of that, Leon had a query to pose. It had been occupying his thoughts for a while. Of course, Marbas allowed him to proceed with his inquiry. So, the young boy disclosed that his predecessor once informed him that it was far more intricate to convert a human being into one of the dead than it was to transform a monster. The boy, who had only just commenced instruction, wished to know if he had achieved a proficiency level where he could convert a person into one of the undead. The beast laughed as his protege had spoken very much like someone who might have a necessity for such an accomplishment. The kitten grinned and inquired wickedly what miserable person the boy yearned so intensely to reanimate, and the boy with dark eyes invoked the name of Leon von Marbas. The individual that the young boy so desperately wanted to transform into a corpse was his own relative.
Meanwhile, his uncle was still somehow cheerfully dining and reveling. The man possessed no sense of self-preservation and was truly the type who only enjoyed living in the present instant. It was rather mortifying to observe, especially for a person with so many adversaries. He sat with his henchmen and women, snickering and getting inebriated, and the young women in turn shrieked and tittered alongside the Finnish man. Kirchhoff laughed that the late patriarch was an idiot, yet his personal affairs had been smooth sailing ever since Rune passed away. This was the life of a man of seizing opportunity, and he laughed as his companions agreed with him. The man was intoxicated, and his senseless sycophant was all too willing to concur with him. Now all that remained was to handle the soul's successor. Slicked-back Heir was confident that Sir Kirchhoff must be feeling the weight lift somewhat from his shoulders, and the man scoffed, saying that eliminating the boy hardly represented such a significant challenge. Once again, he requested his associates to lift their drinking vessels and to consume their fill. There were exceptionally few days that were as fortunate as this. Suddenly, they heard a powerful sound and paused. The vibration persisted throughout the structure, and a few items shattered as the location began to shake. Retribution was approaching, and the young women shrieked when the large lamp fixture collapsed. The older man suddenly frowned and became attentive, wondering what was occurring. This establishment was supposed to be the type that could be shielded by a magical talisman. It should require more than this to shake the entire edifice. The older man then became even more serious, commanding the woman beside him to remain quiet. This was no ordinary tremor. The older man yelled into the darkness, asking who had arrived at this hour. There was not a single person remaining in the Marbas territory with the audacity to make an attempt against his existence, and the man was fearless. Leon could not help but ask exactly what had given his uncle such an assumption. The boy appeared now, his gaze as blank as always as lightning flashed behind him. The uncle stared with amusement, foolishly unafraid of his nephew. The young leader of a degraded house is what he called him, as his own security personnel emerged behind him, prepared to slice Leon into fragments. The boy stared at his uncle, stared at the man who should have been kin, who should have been defending him. Then Leon expressed how gracious of Kirchhoff to acknowledge his patriarch. His uncle laughed, seeing no justification why the boy would visit unannounced at such a late hour, and he inquired what business he had with him. Now that was genuinely an unusual question, the young patriarch. The head of the estate did not necessitate a justification to visit a subordinate, much less a vassal like his uncle. He did not need to announce his objectives beforehand for his convenience. Kirchhoff glared, stating that he supposed any other worthy lord would have no requirement for such civilities, but he considered the young boy far from deserving to rule over even a container of mice. The man laughed, asking if the youth was terrified that his position as the patriarch might be confiscated from him. It was too late, and the boy's unfortunate father was no longer present to keep him protected. The man sneered and mocked and ridiculed Leon, who just stared impassively at the elderly man. Then Leon pushed aside the curtains that separated them, stepping into the chamber where his uncle was seated. The boy stated that he was not apprehensive now, that he possessed the means to ensure his own safety. The uncle scoffed, asking the boy what his newfound intelligence informed him about arriving here unaccompanied. It was daring of the boy to seek out his uncle as if he had multiple lives to spare. However, the young patriarch did not believe confronting his uncle necessitated any degree of audacity. It was presumptuous of the older man to assume that the young boy had arrived alone. The uncle now frowned, wondering what his nephew was rambling about. That is when the structure trembled once more, and the uncle looked around in astonishment and bewilderment. This was abnormal, and these tremors could not originate from some ordinary magic. The mystical energy that pulsed along the barriers in the flooring was that of the void. And now the older man realized that he recognized this sensation, and he was familiar with this darkness far deeper than any mortal could ever know. The older man flinched, hoping that it was not what he feared, that after years of inactivity, his worst nightmare could not possibly come to fruition. But that was precisely the situation, and goblins staggered into the room. The walking dead had emerged, and Leon confirmed their presence as the undead. The older man stared, pale with terror, asking how such an occurrence could be feasible. Not even his late brother could command such power, much less at a young age. The boy looked bored, stating that it ought to be apparent House Marbas was once renowned for its greatest influence. That is, that their lineage was directly connected to the demonic, and that their family had contributed to the establishment of so well-known teachings, such as the Arsagoeca,
or a clan of dark sorcerers. The older man gnashed his teeth in fury at this sudden burst of misfortune. He yelled and gestured, instructing his security personnel to cut down those hideous anomalies immediately. The guards rushed forward to assault the undead, and the undead enemies awaited their arrival. The armed men flew forward, overwhelming the undead with mass numbers and deadly competence, all racing to cut down the boy with the blank eyes. However, the undead moved first. The undead goblins fought to defend their master, grinning with vicious glee. The men were shocked to see the undead retaliating, as they had underestimated the boy's capability. The undead did indeed fight back, and it sliced directly through one of the armed men. The man toppled in a splatter of fluid and fell to the floor before the uncle and the remainder of his security personnel. The older man stared in horror as he realized that he was now in a very precarious situation. The goblins made quick work of the other guards, moving at great speed to eliminate the armed men. One by one, more guards fell, much to the apprehension of the other guards watching, and the uncle called the boy a monster. The guards were